William Devin Howell was born on February 11, 1970, in the small town of Bridgeport, Connecticut. To many, he appeared to be just another face in the crowd, a person with a seemingly ordinary life. However, as his story would unfold, it would reveal a darker, more sinister side, a side that would forever change the lives of the people in Connecticut and the entire criminal justice system. Howell's childhood was marked by signs of trouble that would later come to define him as an adult. Though not much is known about his early years, some accounts suggest that his upbringing was far from ideal. While he was not raised in extreme poverty, there were indications of emotional distress in his family environment. Throughout his youth, Howell struggled with behavioral issues, and as he grew older, those issues evolved into something far more dangerous. In the early stages of his adult life, Howell was able to mask his true nature with a charming and outgoing personality. He seemed like a regular man with the potential for a normal life. However, beneath the surface, something darker lurked. Howell's ability to deceive those around him would soon help him hide his true intentions. For years, he managed to keep his secrets hidden, blending into his community. But despite his outward appearances, Howell's predatory behavior began to surface in the early 2000s. It was then that he would begin a killing spree that would haunt Connecticut for years to come. His first known victims were women. Howell, like many serial killers, targeted those who were most vulnerable, often women struggling with addiction or living on the margins of society. Howell preyed on them, luring them to secluded spots under false pretenses. His cold and calculating behavior left no room for compassion or empathy. The timeline of Howell's criminal activity began in 2003, when he started targeting women in Connecticut. The women were often vulnerable, and Howell used his charm and manipulative tactics to gain their trust. Once he had them alone, he would strike. Although Howell would later become infamous for the brutality of his actions, at this early stage, his methods were as cold and calculated as any professional criminal. At first, the police had no idea that they were dealing with a serial killer. The disappearances of these women went largely unnoticed, and the community did not connect the dots. Each woman seemed to vanish without a trace, leaving behind only questions and grief for their families. The case seemed like it might be another cold missing person case, but the truth was far more chilling. Howell's ability to blend into society was a factor that allowed him to evade capture for so long. He was a man who seemed harmless to those around him, making it difficult for anyone to suspect his true nature. Little did they know, Howell was beginning a dark journey that would eventually leave 7 women dead, their bodies hidden in the woods behind a shopping plaza in New Britain, Connecticut. As Howell's story begins to unfold, it's important to remember the lives he shattered. These women were real people, with families and dreams of their own. Their stories were stolen by Howell's actions, and their families were left to pick up the pieces of a tragedy that seemed impossible to understand. In the next part, we will dive deeper into Howell's calculated actions and the investigation that would eventually lead to his arrest. But for now, it's important to remember the families who lost so much and the cold reality of the monster Howell had become. His actions are a stark reminder of the darkness that can sometimes lie hidden behind a seemingly normal exterior. As the years passed and the women continued to disappear, the authorities remained clueless. The disappearances of these vulnerable women, many of them sex workers and drug addicts, did not immediately raise alarm bells. At first, their cases seemed to blend together, with no clear connection between them. However, in 2004, a breakthrough came in a case that would eventually lead investigators straight to William Devin Howell. It started with the disappearance of a woman named Vanessa Arizmendi. She was last seen in late March of 2004. Arizmendi was 29 years old, struggling with addiction, and had become involved in dangerous circles. Her family feared for her safety, and her disappearance was not taken lightly. This time, the investigation gained more traction, and the police began to dig deeper. They had no idea that they were about to stumble upon one of the most shocking cases in Connecticut history. Howell had recently been arrested for a minor drug offense, and at first it seemed like just another routine arrest. But as detectives began to examine his background, they discovered several troubling facts. In particular, Howell's van was of interest. When police seized the vehicle, they found several disturbing clues that linked him to Arizmendi's disappearance. The seat cushions in the van had been removed, and blood was found on the floor beneath the carpet. The blood did not match Howell's own, but DNA testing revealed that one of the blood samples was nearly 100% certain to be that of Arizmendi. This discovery was a major turning point in the case. Suddenly, Howell was no longer just a man caught up in a minor drug offense. He was a suspect in a much larger, far more terrifying crime. However, despite this evidence, there was still no sign of Arizmendi's body, and Howell denied any involvement in her disappearance. He continued to insist that the blood was from a physical altercation between Arizmendi and her boyfriend, a claim that many in law enforcement found dubious. At the same time, investigators began to uncover even more shocking evidence. Inside Howell's van, they discovered 6 videotapes. The footage on these tapes showed Howell engaging in bizarre and disturbing acts with women. What was most alarming about the tapes was that the faces of the women were never clearly visible, and their identities remained a mystery. The videos did nothing to help prove Arizmendi's fate, but they painted a chilling portrait of Howell's twisted mind. It was clear that he had been engaging in some kind of dark and secretive behavior long before Arizmendi's disappearance. While Howell was not yet charged with murder, the investigation into Arizmendi's case took a significant turn when another discovery was made. In January of 2005, the skeletal remains of several women were found in a wooded area behind a shopping plaza in New Britain, Connecticut. These remains were later identified as belonging to 3 women: Diane Cusack, Anna Martinez, and Kimberly Menard. The discovery of the bodies in such a remote area was a chilling revelation, and it became clear that the women had been murdered and dumped there. As the investigation continued, more remains were uncovered. In April of 2015, the bodies of Arizmendi, Gonzalez, Camillini, and Wisnant were discovered. All of them had been killed by Howell and dumped in the same location. The authorities were now certain that they were dealing with a serial killer, and Howell became the prime suspect in the deaths of at least 7 women. The true extent of Howell's crimes had yet to be fully understood, but the evidence against him was mounting. He was charged with the murder of several women, and investigators began to piece together his gruesome pattern of behavior. Howell had been meticulous in his actions, using his van to transport the women to secluded areas where he would murder them. His ability to evade capture for so long only made the case even more terrifying. The fear that had been building in Connecticut now had a name: William Devin Howell. At this point, Howell's arrest seemed inevitable, but he continued to deny any involvement in the killings, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. In the next part of this story, we will explore how Howell's trial unfolded and how he eventually faced justice for his crimes. But for now, it's important to understand the scale of the horror that had been unfolding in Connecticut as Howell's reign of terror began to come into focus. The families of the victims who had suffered for so long would finally get the answers they had been desperately seeking. As the investigation into William Devin Howell's crimes progressed, the authorities were slowly beginning to piece together the full extent of his horrific actions. By the time the bodies of several of Howell's victims had been recovered, the case was no longer just about one missing woman, Vanessa Arizmendi. It had evolved into a serial murder investigation involving at least 7 women, and Howell was at the center of it all. The discovery of the remains behind the shopping plaza in New Britain was the grim confirmation that a serial killer was operating in Connecticut, and Howell's arrest seemed imminent. In the early days of 2006, Howell was formally charged with the murder of Vanessa Arizmendi, the first of the victims to be identified. The evidence against him was strong, with the DNA found in his van, matching that of Arizmendi, and the videotapes found in his vehicle pointing to his sinister behavior. Despite this, Howell continued to deny any involvement in the killings, and his defense team began to strategize his legal options. It was clear that Howell was going to fight the charges with everything he had, even as the case against him grew stronger with each passing day. As the trial moved forward, the prosecution built an airtight case, drawing on the evidence from Howell's van, the DNA samples, and the recovered remains. But just as the case seemed to be reaching its climax, something unexpected happened. In January of 2007, Howell entered an offered plea, a legal maneuver in which a defendant does not admit guilt, but acknowledges that the prosecution has enough evidence to secure a conviction. Howell's decision to take this plea was a shocking turn in the case. By pleading guilty to first-degree manslaughter, Howell avoided the possibility of a trial and the risk of facing the death penalty. The offered plea allowed Howell to maintain his innocence while conceding that the evidence against him was overwhelming. He did not admit to killing Vanessa Arizmendi, but he acknowledged that the prosecution had enough evidence to convict him. This legal strategy was not without controversy, and it left many wondering why Howell would plead guilty to manslaughter rather than face the full consequences of his actions in a trial. Some believed that Howell took the plea to avoid the death penalty, as Connecticut had abolished the death penalty in 2015. Others speculated that he was trying to minimize the damage to his reputation. Howell's plea of manslaughter was accepted, and in February of 2007, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. It was a sentence that many felt was far too lenient for a man who had taken the lives of at least 7 women. But even though Howell was behind bars, the case was far from over. Investigators were still uncovering new evidence and making new discoveries about the true scale of his crimes. In the years that followed Howell's conviction, additional remains were discovered, and the identity of more victims became clear. In 2015, the remains of several more women were found, leading to a renewed investigation into Howell's crimes. These victims included Arizmendi, Gonzalez, Camellini, and Wisnant, all of whom had been killed by Howell and left behind in the wooded area behind the shopping plaza. As the bodies were identified, it became apparent that Howell's reign of terror had lasted much longer than originally thought. Despite his guilty plea, Howell continued to show little remorse for his actions. In a chilling moment, he confided in a fellow inmate, describing how he had kept the body of one of his victims in his van for 2 weeks because it was too cold outside to bury her. He admitted to sleeping next to her body and even referred to her as his baby. It was a disturbing revelation that painted a terrifying picture of Howell's psyche. As more details of Howell's past actions came to light, the true horror of his crimes became undeniable. He had managed to evade detection for so long, hiding his gruesome acts behind a facade of normalcy. It was only after his arrest that the full extent of his depravity was uncovered. And while Howell's offered plea may have spared him the death penalty, the damage done by his actions could never be undone. In November of 2017, Howell's fate was sealed. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences, amounting to a total of 360 years in prison. This sentence came after he pleaded guilty to the murders of 6 more women: Cusack, Martinez, Menard, Gonzalez, Camellini, and Roberts. During his sentencing, Howell cried and apologized to the families of the victims, calling his actions monstrous, cowardly, and selfish. He told the court that he deserved the death penalty, but by then Connecticut had already abolished it. The case of William Devin Howell was a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives. His crimes left a trail of devastation, not only for the victims, but for their families and the community at large. The trial and the eventual sentencing provided a sense of closure to those who had waited for years to see justice served. But for Howell, the true weight of his actions may never fully be understood. As he spends his days in prison, serving out his life sentences, the victims of his brutal crimes remain at the forefront of the public's memory, a haunting reminder of the true cost of his reign of terror. The arrest and subsequent conviction of William Devin Howell left a permanent mark on the state of Connecticut. The horror of his crimes continued to haunt the local communities, where the gruesome discovery of remains behind a strip mall in New Britain shattered the sense of safety that many once took for granted. Howell's reign of terror, lasting from 2003 to 2004, left behind a trail of devastation that would ripple through the families and friends of the victims for years to come. One of the lasting legacies of Howell's crimes is the profound effect they had on the victims' families. The recovery of remains in wooded areas and marshy grounds meant that many families had to endure the excruciating wait to identify their loved ones. For some, the heartbreak of waiting for closure was compounded by the fact that the discovery of the remains came years after their loved ones had disappeared. The process of identifying the victims, piecing together their final moments, and facing the reality of their loss was a painful and prolonged ordeal. For the victims' families, Howell's conviction brought some form of justice, but it could never erase the grief of losing someone in such a horrific way. In particular, the families of victims like Jennifer Menard, Jeanette Gonzalez, and Barbara Camellini were forced to relive the terror of their loved ones' final moments. Howell's cold and callous demeanor during his trial, especially his lack of remorse, only served to deepen the pain for those left behind. His statement during sentencing, where he referred to his actions as monstrous, cowardly, and selfish, was seen by many as an attempt to portray himself as a victim of his own crimes. Yet for the families, these words felt like empty gestures in the face of the unimaginable loss they had suffered. The broader community was also deeply affected by Howell's crimes. New Britain, a city known for its small-town feel and tight-knit community, found itself grappling with the reality that a serial killer had been operating in their midst. The fear and anxiety that followed Howell's arrest led to a profound shift in the way people viewed their own safety. Residents became more vigilant, and the sense of trust that had once defined the community was forever changed. Parents began to question the safety of their children, and friends and neighbors found themselves uncertain of who they could trust. Howell's case was a chilling reminder of the unpredictable nature of serial killings. Despite living in a community that seemed ordinary, with no obvious signs of danger, the reality of his crimes shattered the illusion of safety. The unpredictability of serial killings and the randomness of victim selection left many people feeling vulnerable. Howell's ability to blend into society while committing his heinous acts highlighted the disturbing fact that serial killers can often go unnoticed until it's too late. The investigation into Howell's crimes also had a significant impact on law enforcement in Connecticut. The case prompted a reevaluation of investigative strategies and the ways in which police departments across the state collaborated with one another. As Howell's crimes unfolded, it became clear that there were lessons to be learned about the importance of thorough investigations, careful attention to detail, and the need for persistence when pursuing serial killers. The search for Howell's victims, the uncovering of new evidence, and the eventual identification of all 7 victims were the result of years of hard work by law enforcement officers who remained determined to bring justice to the families of the murdered women. In addition to these procedural changes, Howell's case also raised questions about the broader issue of society's treatment of vulnerable individuals. Many of Howell's victims were women who struggled with addiction or were involved in sex work, often marginalized by society. Howell targeted these women, exploiting their vulnerabilities for his own twisted desires. The case shed light on the risks faced by individuals in these vulnerable positions and the ways in which society often turns a blind eye to their suffering. It also underscored the need for better support systems for those at risk of becoming victims of violent crime. In the years following Howell's conviction, there were calls from the public and advocacy groups for reforms in how authorities handle cases involving missing persons, especially those involving vulnerable individuals. Howell's crimes and the long period it took to uncover the full scope of his killings made it clear that there was still much work to be done in terms of victim advocacy and law enforcement training. Many believed that better resources, combined with a more comprehensive approach to investigating missing persons cases, could have potentially saved lives. The case of William Devin Howell highlighted the importance of early intervention and the need for law enforcement agencies to be equipped with the tools necessary to prevent future tragedies. As Howell spends his life behind bars, serving 6 consecutive life sentences, the legacy of his crimes continues to affect the families, the community, and the state of Connecticut. Howell's story serves as a stark reminder of the darkness that can exist even in the most seemingly ordinary places. His victims' names may have been forgotten by some, but their memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved them, and in the lessons learned from this tragic chapter in the Connecticut's history. While Howell's reign of terror may have ended with his conviction, the scars left behind by his actions will never fully fade. On the night of October 19th, 1974, the quiet city of New Britain, Connecticut, was shaken by one of the most horrific crimes in the state's history. The Donna Bakery, a small yet well-loved local business, became the site of a brutal mass murder that left 6 people dead. It was an event that would haunt the community for decades, forever marking the bakery as the location of a senseless tragedy. The Donna Bakery was more than just a place to buy fresh bread and pastries. It was a cornerstone of the neighborhood. Owned by John Salerni, the bakery had been named after his daughter, Donna Salerni, a college freshman at the time. On that fateful Saturday night, John Salerni was working inside his bakery, unaware that within moments, his life and the lives of 5 others would come to a violent end. Among the victims were not just employees, but customers who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Helen Santi, William J. Donahue Jr., Thomas Dowling, and Ann Dowling were inside the bakery when the killers entered. A passerby, Michael P. Cron, had stopped in only to ask for directions. He too became an unfortunate victim. Authorities later pieced together the events of that night. The killers, Ronald Tiny Piskorski and Gary Schrager, had targeted the bakery for a robbery. However, what may have started as a planned theft quickly turned into a mass execution. Witnesses, it seemed, were not to be left alive. The victims were ordered to lie face down on the floor in the back of the bakery, where they were each shot in the back of the head. John Salerni was killed differently. His life was taken by a shotgun blast, while the others were slain with a different firearm. At first, investigators struggled to understand why the murders had escalated beyond a robbery. As the case unfolded, a chilling theory emerged. One of the victims had recognized one of the killers. Michael Crone, who was related to Gary Schrager by marriage, may have identified him, prompting the killers to eliminate all witnesses. As news of the murders spread, fear gripped the city of New Britain. People who had once felt safe in their neighborhoods now locked their doors and looked over their shoulders. The bakery, once a symbol of warmth and community, had become a place of horror. While investigators worked tirelessly to track down the perpetrators, the brutality of the crime left an undeniable scar on the community. The case would soon take a dramatic turn, but on that night, all anyone knew was that 6 innocent people had been slain, and the killers had disappeared into the night. In the aftermath of the brutal killings at the Donna Bakery, law enforcement faced a crime that was as shocking as it was perplexing. With 6 victims executed in cold blood and no immediate suspects, New Britain police launched an intense investigation. Their first challenge was determining whether the motive had been robbery, personal revenge, or something more sinister. Detectives quickly noted the organized nature of the crime. The killers had left no survivors, suggesting that eliminating witnesses was their primary concern. The scene itself offered limited physical evidence, no fingerprints, no direct leads, and no clear indication of who had carried out the attack. However, early theories pointed to the idea that the victims had not been randomly selected. While robbery was initially considered the most likely motive, doubts arose when investigators reviewed the crime scene. The cash register had been emptied, but police questioned whether the stolen money alone had been worth the extreme violence. Further examination revealed that the killers had made no attempt to ransack the bakery for additional valuables, leading authorities to suspect that their real priority had been silencing anyone who could identify them. Witnesses from nearby businesses provided small but valuable details. Some recalled seeing 2 men lurking near the bakery earlier that evening. Others mentioned an unfamiliar vehicle parked nearby that had disappeared around the time of the murders. These early accounts gave police a starting point, but without names or concrete descriptions, progress was slow. As detectives worked to piece together the timeline, they also examined the backgrounds of the victims. Michael Crone's presence at the scene stood out. He was not an employee, nor a regular customer. His connection to Gary Schrager raised suspicions. If he had recognized one of the killers, it could explain why the massacre had taken place instead of a simple robbery. Days turned into weeks, and public fear grew. The idea that killers were still on the loose left residents uneasy. The New Britain Police Department faced increasing pressure to solve the case, as the gruesome nature of the crime had gained statewide attention. Connecticut had never seen a mass murder of this scale before, and the authorities knew they had to act fast before the perpetrators disappeared for good. Then a breakthrough came, a tip from an unlikely source. Information surfaced that pointed law enforcement toward 2 men with violent pasts and ties to criminal activity. It was a lead that would change the direction of the case entirely. As detectives delved deeper into their investigation, the breakthrough they had been hoping for began to take shape. A tip from a local informant led them to Ronald F. Piskorski and Gary B. Schrager, 2 men with violent criminal backgrounds. Piskorski, a former bar bouncer and circus bear wrestler, had been known to the local police for his involvement in various criminal activities. Schrager, a drifter, had a history of petty crimes and had spent time in jail. The connection between the 2 men was not immediately clear, but it was a lead that could not be ignored. Piskorski and Schrager's pasts seemed to provide more than enough motive for investigators to focus their attention on them. Both men had long histories of involvement with crime, including robbery and assault. They were familiar with the area, and their criminal habits seemed to align with the details of the murders. However, the authorities had no direct evidence linking them to the bakery killings. The investigation took a more concrete turn when detectives discovered that Schrager had a personal connection to one of the victims, Michael Crone, who was Schrager's uncle by marriage. This revelation raised significant concerns for the police. They theorized that Crone may have recognized Schrager during the robbery, and fearing that he could identify him, Schrager and Piskorski decided to eliminate him along with the other witnesses. This theory explained the extreme violence and precision with which the crime had been carried out. During their investigation, police also learned that Schrager had been seen in the area around the time of the murders. Witnesses recalled seeing Schrager and Piskorski leaving the bakery shortly after the killings, which seemed to further strengthen the case against them. Schrager, however, was elusive. He had gone into hiding and remained on the run for a period of time, complicating the investigation. Meanwhile, Piskorski's arrest was swiftly handled. He was apprehended on October 22, 1974, just 3 days after the murders. His arrest marked the first major break in the case, but it would be Schrager who would eventually provide the confession that would send shockwaves through the community. Schrager's capture was a little more complicated. He was eventually tracked down and arrested in early 1975, several months after the killings. Once in custody, Schrager remained tight-lipped, but the pressure of the investigation was beginning to take its toll. Police were determined to find the truth, and soon Schrager would be forced to face the consequences of his actions. But it was during his trial that the shocking details of the crime began to emerge. Schrager's strange confession to the murders would both surprise and horrify the public. He admitted to being part of the robbery, but claimed that he had never fired a shot. In his statement, Schrager revealed that both he and Piskorski had gone to the bakery with the intention of robbing it. However, things had taken a dark turn. Schrager confessed that someone had gone into the back room of the bakery and that he had heard several shots. Schrager refused to name the killer, but his testimony provided critical details that pieced together the events leading to the murders. The fact that Schrager admitted to participating in the robbery and being present during the killings made him an accessory to murder, though he tried to downplay his role. However, the lack of direct evidence against him in the murders meant that he would receive a significantly lighter sentence than Piskorski. As Schrager's trial came to a close, the details surrounding the murders of 6 innocent people on the night of October 19th, 1974, became clearer, though no less unsettling. The trial focused not only on the roles of Piskorski and Schrager, but also on the chilling reality that these 2 men had been living among the community after committing such a heinous crime. Despite their arrests, the town of New Britain, Connecticut, was still grappling with the fact that the killers had been so close to them all along, leading many to question how the crime had remained unsolved for so long. Schrager's trial, which began in late 1976, was a stark contrast to the earlier proceedings of Piskorski's trial. While Piskorski had maintained his silence during his trial, Schrager's confession became a central element in his conviction. Though Schrager had admitted to the robbery, his refusal to name the actual shooter led to a lot of speculation. He stated that he had not killed anyone, but remained oddly quiet when it came to identifying Piskorski as the one who fired the fatal shots. His defense tried to minimize his role, painting him as an accessory who had not physically participated in the murders, but the evidence against him was undeniable. While Schrager's confession provided some clarity about the events that led up to the killings, it also raised more questions. How did 2 men, seemingly unremarkable in their individual criminal histories, manage to carry out such a brutal and well-planned attack? And what motivated them to kill so many people when a robbery was all they had initially intended? These questions would linger for years to come as investigators continued to explore the psychology behind the murders. One of the more disturbing aspects of the case was the realization that the victims, John Salerni, Helen Ginsanti, William J. Donahue Jr., Thomas Dowling, Ann Dowling, and Michael P. Crone, had been shot execution-style after being forced to lie face down in the back of the bakery. Each victim was killed in cold blood, and the lack of a clear motive suggested that the killers might have been trying to cover their tracks by eliminating all potential witnesses. In December of 1975, Piskorski's trial concluded, and he was found guilty of the 6 murders. Since capital punishment was not in effect at the time in Connecticut, Piskorski was sentenced to 150 years to life in prison. This sentence meant that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, though there was little comfort in this for the families of the victims. They had hoped for justice, but the brutal nature of the crime and the seemingly indifferent attitude of both Piskorski and Schrager made it difficult to find peace. Schrager, for his part, pled guilty to 4 of the 6 murders, admitting his role in the robbery, but again refusing to identify Piskorski as the shooter. His guilty plea led to a sentence of 20 years to life, which was a lighter sentence compared to Piskorski's. Schrager's refusal to cooperate fully with authorities left a cloud of frustration hanging over the case. His strenuous efforts to gain parole over the years were met with resistance, particularly from the families of the victims who expressed their deep concerns about his release. In 1997, after several parole hearings, it was determined that Schrager would never be set free. This ruling brought some semblance of closure to the families who had long fought against his parole, knowing that he would remain behind bars for the remainder of his life. But despite the justice served in the form of these sentences, the true motivations behind the murders remain a chilling mystery. Why did Schrager and Piskorski choose to kill so many people during what was originally planned as a robbery? Was it fear of identification, as investigators had theorized, or was there something more? The lack of a clear, consistent motive meant that these questions would continue to haunt the community of New Britain for many years after the trials were over. The Donnelly Bakery murders may have been solved, but for many, the pain and fear felt on that night in October of 1974 would never fully fade. The small-town community would never be the same again, and the echoes of that brutal crime would live on in the memories of those who lived through it. As time passed, the final chapter of the Donnelly Bakery murders began to settle into the history books, but the emotional scars left behind by the brutal killings would linger far longer. Ronald F. Piskorski, the man responsible for taking the lives of 6 innocent victims, died on November 9th, 2024, at the age of 76, while serving his sentence in a Connecticut prison. His death marked the end of a long and bitter period for the families of those he murdered. While the passage of time may have brought some sense of finality to the case, the pain endured by the victims' families would never fully be erased. Gary B. Schrager, the second man involved in the murders, remains in prison to this day. Now aged 81, Schrager is currently serving his sentence in a Minnesota penitentiary. Unlike Piskorski, Schrager's role in the killings was not as directly implicated, but his participation in the robbery and his guilty plea for the murders were enough to convict him. Despite his attempts to secure parole over the years, Schrager's sentence remains intact. In 1997, the parole board made it clear that Schrager would never be released, a decision that brought some comfort to the families who had been fighting for justice for decades. For the town of New Britain, Connecticut, the shock and grief from the night of October 19th, 1974, never truly faded. While justice had been served, the community's trust in those around them had been shaken. The idea that 2 men, seemingly unremarkable, could commit such an atrocity in their midst haunted everyone who had been a part of the tight-knit neighborhood. The victims, John Salerni, Helen Ginsanti, William J. Donahue Jr., Thomas Dowling, Ann Dowling, and Michael P. Crone, were more than just names in a case file. They were loved members of the community, people who had touched the lives of those around them. Their loss left a void that could never be filled. The tragic murders of the Donnelly Bakery remain one of Connecticut's most infamous and heartbreaking cases. The investigation that began with few clues and the initial mystery of the killings unraveled over time, ultimately bringing the perpetrators to justice. But the case also raised troubling questions about the motivations behind the murderous attack. Was it really just about a robbery gone wrong, or was something more at play? The killers, especially Schrager, were not willing to fully explain their reasons for the murders, leaving the families and the community with more questions than answers. Now, nearly 5 decades later, the story of the Donnelly Bakery murders remains a part of the state's dark history. The 2 men who carried out the senseless killings may be behind bars or deceased, but the emotional and psychological impact of their actions still echoes throughout the years. The families of the victims continue to mourn, but at least they know that justice was eventually served. Though the case has been closed, the memory of the lives lost that night continues to haunt those who remember the tragedy. The Donnelly Bakery murders will always be a reminder of how fragile life is and how one act of violence can change a community forever. The unsolved disappearance of William Billy Smolinski Jr. is a haunting mystery that has puzzled the small community of Waterbury, Connecticut for nearly 2 decades. Billy was a 31-year-old man with a bright future ahead of him, known for his kindness and strong family ties. He was last seen on August 24th, 2004, at his home on Holly Street. What began as an ordinary day soon turned into a nightmare for Billy's loved ones, who have been left grappling with unanswered questions and heartache. Billy's disappearance is filled with eerie details and unsettling clues. One of his last known actions was making a threatening phone call to a man named Chris Sorensen, who was involved with Billy's ex-girlfriend, Madeline Gleason. Billy's message to Sorensen to watch his back hints at underlying tensions and conflicts that may have played a role in his fate. Despite extensive searches and investigations, no trace of Billy has ever been found, leaving his family and the community in a perpetual state of anguish and uncertainty. The chilling story of Billy Smolinski is not just about a missing person. It's a tale of unresolved grief, tireless efforts for justice, and the dark, often frustrating path that families of the missing must walk. As we delve into the details of Billy's disappearance, the investigation, and the impact on those who loved him, we uncover a story that is as perplexing as it is tragic. Join us as we explore the mysterious case of Billy Smolinski, a man whose life was abruptly and inexplicably cut short, leaving behind a trail of eerie clues and unanswered questions. On August 24th, 2004, Billy Smolinski's routine day took a mysterious and alarming turn. He had recently broken up with his girlfriend, Madeline Gleason, suspecting she was cheating on him. That morning, in a desperate attempt to confront her, Billy climbed a ladder to her bedroom window and entered her home. He pleaded with her to reconcile and move in with him, but Madeline refused, saying she needed time to think. This would be their final interaction. Later that day, around 3:30 p.m., Billy spoke with his neighbor, Leroy Henley. He asked Henley to watch his dog, Harley, because he was planning to go up north for a few days. This was not unusual behavior for Billy, who often traveled and made arrangements for Harley's care. Henley agreed, and Billy left, never to be seen again. Billy's absence was immediately felt. He had a close-knit relationship with his family and always stayed in touch. When days passed without any word from him, his family grew increasingly worried. They discovered Billy's truck parked strangely at the end of his driveway, with his keys and wallet hidden under the driver's seat. This unusual detail added to their growing sense of dread. On August 27th, 2004, Billy's family reported him missing. Despite their fears, the initial response from law enforcement was underwhelming. No large-scale search was launched, and it seemed as though Billy's case was not being taken seriously. His dog, left behind without care, was another troubling sign that something was terribly wrong. As days turned into weeks, Billy's family took matters into their own hands. They distributed flyers, conducted interviews, and appeared on television to keep Billy's story alive. Despite their efforts, there was no sign of Billy, and the case began to grow cold. The eerie details surrounding his disappearance, his sudden trip, the cryptic voicemail, and the abandoned truck only deepened the mystery. Billy Smolinski vanished without a trace, leaving his family and friends in a state of perpetual uncertainty and fear. The peaceful community of Waterbury was now shadowed by a chilling mystery, and the hunt for answers was just beginning. When Billy Smolinski was reported missing on August 27, 2004, the initial investigation by the Waterbury Police Department was slow and fraught with missed opportunities. Despite the family's insistence that something was terribly wrong, law enforcement did not immediately launch a large-scale search or treat the case with the urgency it deserved. Frustrated but determined, Billy's family began their own search efforts. Detectives Steve Pedbrznak and Szoska started by examining Billy's phone records. They discovered that the last calls made from his phone on August 24th were to a man named Chris Sorensen, When questioned, Sorensen revealed that he had received threatening voicemails telling him to watch his back. Billy's sister, Paula Bell, confirmed that the voice on the messages was indeed Billy's. This discovery hinted at a possible conflict involving Billy's ex-girlfriend, Madeline Gleason, and her new romantic interest. In the early stages of the investigation, several witnesses came forward with unsettling accounts. A young girl reported seeing men in the woods carrying what she believed was a body. Another witness saw a white truck, matching the description of Billy's, in the woods behind her house. Additionally, a group of 20-year-olds hanging out in a parking lot late at night claimed to have seen a man walking into a deserted driving range carrying large bags. These eerie sightings fueled the family's fears and pointed to foul play. The Waterbury Police Department searched Billy's home but found no signs of a struggle or foul play. However, the presence of his truck, with his keys and wallet hidden inside, raised alarm bells. The fact that Billy had left his beloved dog Harley behind was completely out of character and suggested he had not planned to be away for long. As days turned into weeks, the family's frustration with the police grew. Billy's parents, Jan and Bill Smolinski, hired private investigators and set up their own tip line. They put up billboards along Interstate 84, pleading for information about their missing son. Despite their relentless efforts, leads were scarce, and the investigation struggled to gain momentum. The initial search efforts included volunteers combing through the Naugatuck River and surrounding areas, but these efforts yielded no substantial clues. As the days passed without any new information, the sense of urgency began to wane, and Billy's case started to grow cold. The family's hope for a swift resolution was fading, and the chilling reality of Billy's disappearance was setting in. In these early days, the investigation was marked by a series of eerie clues and frustrating dead ends. The community of Waterbury was on edge, haunted by the unsettling mystery of Billy Smolinski's disappearance. The search for Billy was far from over, and the family's determination to find answers would drive them to continue their quest for the truth, despite the mounting challenges. As weeks turned into months, the search for Billy Smolinski intensified. Frustrated with the slow progress of the Waterbury Police Department, Billy's family took matters into their own hands. They hired private investigators, reached out to media outlets, and organized extensive search efforts across Connecticut. The billboards they erected along Interstate 84 became a constant reminder of Billy's unresolved disappearance. Despite their efforts, the investigation was plagued by misleading tips and dead ends. One such lead came from Chad Hansen, who claimed to know where Billy's body was buried. Hansen's information led authorities to conduct 3 extensive searches in various locations, including a residential driveway in Shelton, private property on Bungay Road, and a wooded area in Oxford. Each time, the searches turned up nothing. Hansen later admitted to lying, leading to his arrest and conviction for providing false information. His false leads cost the police over $100,000 and diverted critical resources away from other potential leads. Meanwhile, the police continued to explore the possibility that Billy's disappearance was linked to his ex-girlfriend, Madeline Gleason, and her new lover, Chris Sorensen. Suspicion also fell on Madeline's late son, Sean Karpiuk, who had died of a drug overdose in 2005. Hansen had claimed that Sean killed Billy with a hammer and that they buried his body together. However, without concrete evidence, these claims remained unproven. In addition to Hansen's false leads, the investigation was further complicated by a civil suit brought against the Smolinski family by Madeline Gleason. She accused them of harassment for putting up flyers near her home. The legal battle dragged on for years, draining the family's resources and adding to their emotional burden. Although the Connecticut Supreme Court eventually sided with the Smolinskis, the ordeal highlighted the challenges they faced in their pursuit of justice. Throughout the investigation, Billy's family remained relentless in their quest for answers. They continued to work closely with private investigators, and kept pressure on the police to keep the case active. They reached out to the public through interviews, television appearances, and social media, hoping that someone, somewhere, might have information that could lead to Billy's whereabouts. In 2012, nearly 8 years after Billy's disappearance, the case received renewed attention when it was featured on the television show Disappeared. The episode brought national attention to the case and generated new tips, but none led to a breakthrough. Despite the numerous challenges and setbacks, the Smolinski family's determination never wavered. They continued to push for improvements in how missing person cases were handled, both locally and nationally. Their efforts culminated in the passage of Billy's Law in 2022, which aimed to close gaps in the missing person system and provide better support for families like theirs. The investigation into Billy Smolinski's disappearance remains active, but the passage of time has not dulled the pain of his loss. His family continues to hope for answers, clinging to the belief that one day the truth will come to light. The community of Waterbury remains haunted by the mystery, and Billy's story serves as a stark reminder of the many families still waiting for closure. As the years passed, the search for Billy Smolinski continued, marked by a relentless pursuit of answers and an unwavering hope for resolution. Despite the numerous obstacles, Billy's family never gave up. They held on to the belief that someday they would uncover the truth about what happened to their beloved son and brother. In the face of countless setbacks, the Smolinski family's resilience became an inspiring testament to their love for Billy. They turned their pain into purpose, advocating for legislative changes that would help other families in similar situations. Their efforts bore fruit with the passage of Billy's Law in 2022, a landmark piece of legislation aimed at improving the handling of missing person cases across the United States. The law mandated better training for law enforcement, streamlined the process of reporting and investigating missing persons, and created a unified database, namus.gov, to aid in the search for missing individuals. Despite these significant strides, the mystery of Billy's disappearance remained unsolved. The eerie details of the case, the threatening voicemail, the strange sightings, and the cryptic behavior of those involved continued to haunt those who knew Billy and followed his story. His truck, parked at the edge of the driveway with his keys and wallet hidden beneath the seat, remained a chilling reminder of the unanswered questions surrounding his fate. The community of Waterbury was forever changed by Billy's disappearance. His story became a local legend, a cautionary tale that underscored the importance of vigilance and community support in the face of tragedy. The billboards along Interstate 84, emblazoned with Billy's image and the plea for information, stood as silent sentinels, reminding everyone who passed of the unresolved mystery. Billy's parents, Jan and Bill Smolinski, continued to fight for justice, even as the years took their toll. They worked tirelessly to keep Billy's case in the public eye, hoping that someone, somewhere, might hold the key to solving the puzzle. Their dedication was a beacon of hope, not only for their own family, but for countless others who faced similar heartache. The search for Billy also highlighted the critical role of community and the power of collective action. Volunteers, private investigators, and supportive friends and neighbors all played a part in the ongoing effort to find Billy. Their contributions, whether through physical searches, spreading awareness, or providing emotional support, were invaluable. As the investigation moved forward, law enforcement continued to follow leads and revisit old evidence. Advances in forensic technology offered new avenues for exploration, and every tip, no matter how small, was pursued with renewed vigor. The hope was that someday a breakthrough would come, and the long-held secrets surrounding Billy's disappearance would finally be revealed. In the end, the story of Billy Smolinski is one of heartbreak and hope, mystery and resilience. It is a story that underscores the profound impact of loss and the enduring strength of those who refuse to give up. Billy's family remains steadfast in their quest for answers, driven by the love they have for a son and brother taken too soon. The search for Billy continues, and with it, the hope that one day the truth will come to light, bringing peace to those who have waited so long for closure.